This is episode 211 of That Shakespeare Life. In the year 1600, when William Shakespeare was just 36 years old, William Adams became the first Englishman to reach Japan. Adams sailed as part of a multi-ship fleet employed for the expedition by a private Dutch company. Adams would go on to serve in Japan under Shogun Ieyasu, helping to build the first Western-style ships in Japan, and later helping Japan establish trading factories with the Netherlands and England. While Adams held significant influence in Japan during his lifetime, what was most remarkable was the friendship he cultivated with Ieyasu that would last until Ieyasu's death. Here today to share with us the story of this incredible Englishman contemporary to Shakespeare is author of The Shogun Silver Telescope, God, Art, and Money in the English Quest for Japan, Timon Screech. Just like Shakespeare, our show depends on support by listeners just like you, who sign up to be our patrons. You can become a patron of That Shakespeare Life at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and unlock special benefits like detailed show notes, virtual tours, and a lot of other cool Shakespeare goodies we've got over there just for you. Timon Screech taught the history of Japanese art at SOAS University of London for 30 years before moving to the International Research Center for Japanese Studies in Kyoto in 2021 as professor of Japanese history. He has recently published The Shogun's Silver Telescope, God, Art, and Money in the English Quest for Japan, and Tokyo Before Tokyo, Power and Magic in the Shogun City of Edo. He is now completing a major monograph on the deification and cult of Tokugawa Ieyasu, as concurrently working on a short book on early European contacts with the kingdom of Luchu, modern Okinawa. Screech is a freeman of the City of London and fellow of the British Academy. See more information on Timon Screech, including a list of his other publications, in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Timon. Welcome to the show.
Good morning.
The fleet was part of a Dutch private company, but Adams, being English, did he need special permission from King James to leave England as part of this Dutch crew?
At the time, there was already the concept of a passport, and you were obliged to obtain permission to leave if you were the category of person that the government cared about. So a noble or someone couldn't just leave the country. But someone like Adams was not in that case. He was a mariner. Obviously, mariners traveled the world. It wasn't yet at a time when East India companies were kind of jealously guarding their staffs and their trained people. So it was completely routine for Adams to be sailing with a Dutch company. And in fact, we should remember his brother traveled with him. Sadly, the brother didn't make it. He died like so many men did en route. But there were many English people in that voyage.
Was Japan the initial destination of this 5-ship fleet?
Yes, they hoped to get there. They didn't really know what they were aiming for. Japan was a fabled place from Marco Polo, of course, mentioned it, and the Isles of Gold and Jipangu and even Cathay, which we think of today as meaning China, probably really meant Japan because it's referred to as an island. In any case, people knew that there was something out there already. There were reports of Portuguese vessels in Japan that had found a very wealthy country and lots of silver and gold to be exported, lacking the kind of manufactures that Europe could bring them. And so people had an expectation. Now, getting to Japan, of course, was a big, big deal. Maps were extremely inadequate by our standards. They didn't know where they were heading. But you basically had to make a choice of two routes. One was you went around Africa, and then you went directly across the Pacific. It's a very, very long way, but the winds would take you to Java and Sumatra. And then you go through one of the very few straits that Indonesia is so filled with little islands that getting through to the East China Sea is quite tricky. Anyway, having done that, you go past the Philippines and go, that's one route. And that's the one the Portuguese were using. But there was also a way to go down under the south of modern day Chile, in other words, around the Horn, and you would go Terra del Fuego and then go across the Pacific from the other direction. And that was regarded as suicidal, and nobody had ever really succeeded in doing it since Drake had managed. But that's the way they went. And it probably was a miscalculation. It cost them a vast amount of time and human life in ships. But as you intimated, a small element of the fleet eventually got there.
Now, there was some considerable upheaval created by the arrival of these ships when they did finally make it to Japan. The Portuguese Jesuits claimed that the crew members were pirates and tried to have them executed. Timon, why were the Portuguese Jesuits in Japan in the first place? And what interest did they have in accusing these Englishmen of being pirates?
Well, the Portuguese Jesuits were everywhere. And they were there with Portuguese traders and Portuguese slave enslavers, and they were part of the kind of rather grotesque outfit that went in the train of what we think of as the rather glorious days of the Age of Discovery. So Spain and Portugal, of course, were the huge, powerful maritime countries of the period, but the Spanish and Portuguese crowns conjoined, the same as the English and the Scottish crown. One person by chance took both, and in order to avoid squabbles and internecine debates, the Pope was persuaded to divide the world. In fact, the Pope had already begun to think in those terms: divide the world in half for the Spanish and half for the Portuguese. And so the Portuguese went east, and they went through India and Southeast Asia, and the Spanish went west, and they took over Latin America. The dividing line that the Pope drew allowed the Portuguese to keep Brazil because they had already taken large parts of it. That's why Brazil is the only Portuguese-speaking part of Latin America. But these maps were very unclear about the other side of the world. Nobody really knew what was there. The Portuguese claimed that the papal dispensation allowed them Japan. It was theirs. And they got there first. And the Portuguese, on the whole, the Portuguese crown had traditionally supported the Jesuits. So with the Portuguese came the Jesuits. The Spanish crown had traditionally supported the Franciscans, often referred to as friars. They were fratres, brothers, and not always priests. In any case, they took over large parts and attempted to convert large parts of Latin America. So we got two ecclesiastical orders that were also associated with two different countries and two different crowns, but the crowned head was the same person. It was a kind of recipe for all kinds of conflict. At any rate, to answer your question, when the Dutch ship arrived, sorry, can you hear a train in the background? I should just, was that okay?
Let's pause. I can't, but I might not be able to accept on playback. So if you can hear it,
so I'll start again.
Let's pause. Yeah.
You
can pick up at when the Dutch arrived.
Okay, so to get back to your question, when the Dutch ship arrived, just one ship, it had been a fairly impressive fleet that had left Holland before, but it was not at all impressive when it arrived. Most of the men were half dead, most of the men were dead, and the ship was very bedraggled and hardly seaworthy anymore. The Portuguese probably assumed it was a Portuguese ship when they saw it coming in and in a distressed condition, and they went to assist it, and they were, of course, horrified to see Protestants. And we have to remember that a large part of what was then the Netherlands was under Spanish domination, the so-called Spanish Netherlands, today mostly the Catholic part of the Low Countries, i.e. Belgium. And the Dutch were fighting a war of liberation, assisted by the English against the Spanish. So the Spanish and the Dutch, but the Portuguese and the Dutch were at war by virtue of the link to Spain. The English were on the Dutch side, and it was an enemy ship. It wasn't entirely surprising that the Portuguese Jesuits regarded these people who just arrived as a criminal faction. There was also the religious dimension. They were strongly opposed to Protestantism. They were very concerned that Protestants would interfere with the missions. They'd start telling the Japanese that Christendom is divided. By no means everyone in Europe follows the Pope or agrees with the Jesuits. The Jesuits had been expelled from England for nefarious activities. So the Jesuits were terrified this kind of news would leak out, which indeed eventually it did, and the Jesuits are very right to be concerned. Now, as for the claim of piracy, It's a bit of a difficult term.
I can hear that.
As there's a crow flew past.
Oh, okay.
As for the claims of piracy, it's a bit of a terminological issue. One person's pirate is another person's freebooter or explorer. It's a bit like terrorism. It looks different depending on which side of the equation you're on. So that the Spanish probably genuinely believed that the Dutch were going around the world attacking Spanish and Portuguese interests and behaving in an unscrupulous way. The Dutch and the English believed that they were behaving perfectly correctly under terms of war, but the English and the Dutch also would have pointed out that they were never seeking to seize territory. They did later on, but initially the English and the Dutch are pure trading bodies. They are not seizing territory. They're not taking anything away from the Spanish and the Portuguese colonies, much less are they taking anything away from Asian or African kings.
So what happens to Adams and the rest of the crew? They arrived and they're all bedraggled and things are pretty rough for them. And the Jesuits they land and they're accused of piracy. Do they make it? I mean, are they executed for these crimes?
The ship that arrived, the one sole ship called the Liefde, which means charity. The fleet had very Protestant names. The three main ships were called Faith, Hope, and Charity in Dutch language, of course. And the only one that made it was the Charity, the Liefde. And it was very heavily armed because although it was a merchant vessel, they didn't know what they were going to find. They were also very aware that arms could be excellent trading goods in places that they arrived. So the Jesuits and then the Japanese looked at the ship and it was filled with arms. And the Jesuits said, look, how can you believe these are traders? They've come to attack. And the Shogun, obviously, the ruler of Japan, was concerned. The Jesuits said, get rid of the problem immediately, kill them all, and that's this problem solved. But the Shogun, we don't know his deliberations, he didn't write anything down, but he presumably thought another foreign country could be a counterbalance. All his knowledge of Europe and the rest of the world was coming from the Portuguese and the Jesuits, and that news from somewhere else would be very useful. The Japanese were very well aware of triangulating in this way. After all, they'd been dealing with China and Korea against each other, the Ryukyu Islands, modern day Okinawa. Japan's foreign policy was perfectly sophisticated enough to understand this. So Ieyasu called for the most healthy, interrogatable person to be summoned from the ship to meet him. And that happened to be Adam. And if Adams had been sick, the Dutch captain was in fairly good health, and he eventually also, called Kwekenek, he eventually also had a similar encounter. But it was Adams who went first. And Adams was the pilot. In other words, he knew quite a lot about navigation. He wasn't just a sailor. And that might also appeal to the Japanese. He was, as it were, the scientific figure on board. And so he was able to inform the Shogun not just about the ship itself and what it was doing, but also the geography of Europe, many things about the movement of the planets, the way that you can track using instruments and things like that. The Shogun, we know, is very intrigued by this kind of information.
After the fleet arrived or the one ship from the fleet, rather, in Japan, not everyone was allowed to leave Japan and go back home. Timon, was Adams forcibly detained by the Japanese upon his arrival?
It's a bit of another terminological question. Forcibly detained, of course, sounds very modern with a kind of police state kind of thing. The point was that there was no way for the Dutch to leave. I mean, until another Dutch ship turned up, and none was even expected. They couldn't leave unless they trusted themselves to a Portuguese ship, which none of them would have wanted to risk doing. They sent a few letters back with the Portuguese, and some of them were honestly delivered, although probably most weren't. At any rate, they couldn't leave until the next ship came, and the next ship did not come for many years. In fact, 8 years, I believe. So when that ship came, the captain of it offered to take the men home that wanted to leave, and several of them left. Some of them had died. Some of them were doing just fine in Japan. I mean, as somebody who lives in Japan myself, I can tell you, why on earth would you want to leave Japan and go back to Holland? I love Holland, but Japan's a wonderful country, and of course, by 10 years, many of them had wives or girlfriends. They may even have had children. They spoke reasonable Japanese, and their status was probably higher in Japan. At any rate, some did leave. And now Adams particularly had become quite close friends with the Shogun. And we don't exactly know the nature of the friendship. Adams maintained that they were genuine friends. Some of the other English people were amazed and impressed that Adams kind of could walk into the shogun's presence, and ask to talk to him, which most people would never be allowed to do. We don't have so much records from the Japanese side, so it's been a little bit contested, the exact nature. But at any rate, the shogun did rely on Adams for information, and he basically said, yes, you can't go. There's no record stating you're not allowed to go, but Adams intimated that he was told he couldn't leave. But of course, he was given a very tempting offer to stay. He had a Japanese wife at that point, although he had already a wife in England. And he was given land and territory and, wonderful perks. I mean, I'm sure he figured in the end that it was worth his while to stay. Occasionally he expressed a kind of regret at never seeing London again, never seeing his wife or his English daughter. But the calculation probably was that it was worth staying. And of course, who knows that if he left, whether he'd have made it home. The voyage was extremely long and dangerous, and many people left never saw land again.
So it wasn't strictly a prisoner arrangement. I think that's a wonderful frame to put on it. Adams had the risk of even trying to go back it could have been seen as insurmountable from that perspective.
Who knows? I mean, if he'd said to the shogun, listen, he could have absconded. I mean, he could have gone down to this and taken the ship out. He never chose to do that. His calculus clearly was that it made sense to stay.
So what was his role in Japan while he worked for the shogun? What service did he provide there?
He was given status within the shogun's family name is Tokugawa Ieyasu. In fact, he retired as shogun. His son took over, but he remained the most important powerful figure in the land. So the retired shogun took Adams into his household. Technically, they're called bannermen, men who carry the shogun's banner, and it's a fairly high sort of gentleman in waiting kind of status within the household. And that would give him access to an annual salary and lands and servants provided by the Japanese state. But of course, he'd arrived in Japan as an employee of the Dutch company, not the Dutch East India Company, which had not yet been formed, but by the Dutch company that sent the ship. But of course, that contract was not indefinite, and it eventually expired. And after it expired, he became able to trade freely under his own name, as the other Dutch people that were unable to do this did the same thing. And when the English turned up in Japan in 1613, so more than a dozen years after Adams had been there, he's taken on by the English East India Company, and he works with them for a brief period. When that contract expired, he sent ships under his own name to various other Asian ports, never as far as back to England. That would be probably futile, but to wealthy neighboring areas such as the Ryukyus, modern-day Okinawa, to parts of what are now Thailand and Vietnam, and did some very lucrative trading there.
I read somewhere that Adams might have become a samurai during his time in Japan. Can you tell us if this is accurate?
He did. I mean, he was given the status of bannerman, so he had the right to carry swords, which was the indication of a samurai. There are also various dress distinctions that only samurai could have. However, the real formalization of divisions between the samurai class and the commoner class didn't happen until a little bit later. So there probably were quite a large number of people in a gray area. They carried a sword, but they weren't quite properly acknowledged as samurai. The status divisions were still fluid at this point. Don't forget, Japan was in a state of civil war through the entire 16th century. And the Portuguese, the Spanish Jesuits had done their bit to foment the civil war, what one might say. The civil war didn't come to a total end until 1615. So while Adams is there, things are still a little bit inchoate. But yes, it's perfectly reasonable to describe him as a Japanese samurai, and he was given a Japanese name. Probably William Adams was a bit hard to pronounce. So he was called Anjin, and Anjin means the pilot. That was what he'd been on the ship, the navigator. But interestingly, An was also an abbreviation of Anglia, meaning England, and Jin means a person. So Anjin, as well as meaning pilot, can also mean Englishman, and it sets Adams aside from everyone else who was either Portuguese or Dutch or Japanese, obviously.
Now, you referred to Adams's family back in England earlier when you mentioned he had expressed some regret at the end of his life for not having seen them again. But was he able to write to them, or did he communicate with them from Japan at all?
Yes, he sent letters back. The second Dutch ship that turned up and took the men away that wanted to leave brought back letters from Adams. In fact, a couple of them have only just been discovered in the archives of The Hague, but we know because the English East India Company, which came into existence in 1601, so by the time this letters come back from Japan, there's an East India Company functioning in London. They vaguely hear that there's an English person living in Japan who's attained status, and so they hope that he will be their entry point into Japan, which indeed he becomes when the English ship eventually arrives. So he sent letters back. There were kind of, sailors' yarns about this person probably circulating too. His wife lived in Limehouse. People who know the geography of London, just outside Bishopsgate was the eastern gate of the city, and go beyond that, outside the city walls, there was an area called Limehouse still there, with this railway station named after it, where many mariners lived on the Thames. And his wife, Mary, was living there with their daughter, and the daughter's name was Deliverance. And that's a rather interesting name to consider, because Deliverance meant the delivery of England from Spain at the Spanish Armada. Remember that sort of like Cold War situation is still going on. England and Spain attained peace just into the 17th century, but still memories of the horrors of potential Spanish invasion were aware. And Adams would have been telling the Shogun about this, and this is one reason why Adams was he had the ear of the Shogun. He said things the Jesuit priests would never have told him. But in any case, he sent letters to his wife. He sent money back to his wife, and when he died, which he died in 1620, never having left Japan, or never having returned from Japan, he left half his estate to his Japanese family and half to his English family. His wife, his daughter Deliverance, married. We know that she married in London, but nobody has successfully traced what happened afterwards, whether there's any descendants left in England today, who knows, but they wouldn't have the name Adams because he only had a daughter.
To hear Adam's story, it sounds like he was sort of captured in Japan and certainly required to serve. And with these conditions, I'm just surprised that he would be so loyal to the Shogun. I think I'm with the other people who were surprised that Adams expressed this genuine friendship with the Shogun, but he does seem to have been loyal even to the point of being buried in Japan upon his death. Timon, I just wonder if you can explain how this friendship came about, and whether or not Adams's grave is still marked or honored there in Japan today.
The friendship, we would love to know. Adams kept many letters that have survived, and no doubt many letters that haven't survived. Sadly, he didn't keep a diary, or not consistently, so we don't have his thoughts, we don't have his comments. But when the English East India Company arrived and set up a base in Japan, as I said, in 1613, the person that ran that trading station, whose name was Richard Cox, he was a copious diarist and quite a bright person. He was a bit of a cut above the average sailor, if I can say that without sounding elitist. And Richard Cox wrote down a lot of stuff, and he made many comments about Adams's relations with the Shogun. The Dutch, of course, were also writing these things down, because the Dutch had brought Adams to Japan only to find that he sort of helped his fellow countrymen when the English turned up, although Adams remained also very loyal to the Dutch interests. So I suppose he was a rather upstanding kind of figure, Adams. He didn't dump one loyalty for another. Now, the Shogun had saved his life. The Shogun had given him land and territory and status, such things he would never have had in England. Imagine that he never would have even got to meet the Lord Mayor of London, never had a chance to meet King James or being invited to Whitehall. And there he was in the presence of the Shogun. The gorgeousness and the wealth of the Japanese court would have been utterly amazing to him. He'd never been to just Elizabeth I or James I, but one can imagine the Shogun's court was infinitely grander. The climate was better, the food was better. He had a status, especially once he spoke Japanese reasonably well, that he would never have matched in England. So why on earth would he want to leave? I mean, of course, like many exiles or or people who travel the world, there's an occasional nostalgia for home. It would be unexpected that he'd occasionally have a few regrets. I'm just waiting for the train to get. But on the whole, we can assume that he saw no reason to leave. He'd have had to have left all his wealth, his privileges, and there's no guarantee he ever would have made it home. Although the first English ship that went to Japan in 1613, set up this trading station, did get home safely to England. Everyone went back safely, and in fact, some beautiful gifts from the Shogun were given to King James I, some of which still survive.
Well, we've touched on just a really true adventure story here, I think, of the life of William Adams. And I know that we would love to explore his story further. Do you have some favorite books or resources you can recommend we use to learn more?
So there's plenty to read. There's plenty to read on the subject of Adams. Any of your listeners, viewers can Google him and find out. There's many things, but there's one 4-part book which has just come out based on the very latest research by a scholar called Richard Irving, and it's 4 small parts. It's not a voluminous book to read. It's very gripping, and he tells the story in an excellent way. So that's something I would recommend anyone. You can easily find it. There's an online version as well. If I may venture to recommend my own book, if that's not too cheeky,
absolutely.
I wrote something called the Shogun's Silver Telescope. And this first ship that left England in 1611, left England, arrived in Japan in 1613. Of course, they knew that the Spanish and the Portuguese were already there. The Dutch were already there. They knew they had to take the Shogun a really spectacular present in order to get the English admitted and the status guaranteed. So they took a huge, beautiful silver telescope that was actually gold foiled. So it looked gold, it was made of silver. And I tried to trace why they selected a telescope. Of course, a brand new instrument at that time. Galileo's findings were the latest thing, and what the Japanese thought of this when it arrived. I say I tried to because the documentation is extremely sparse, and some of my interpretations were based, of course, on assumptions. I didn't hide the fact that documentation is sparse, and no doubt some people have different opinions. But that I hope I told the story also in a gripping and inciting way.
Which is a fun book to explore too, just in context of Shakespeare's lifetime and the understanding of Galileo, because typically we think of him as being someone who was despised in his own time for questioning the standard perspective on the celestial sphere, and then to see his inventions being not only accepted but then used to trade at the highest levels was a pretty fascinating perspective that I thought.
Yes.
But
shall I answer that? Is there time?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So Galileo's struggles with the church came a little bit later. The Jesuit order was a fairly intellectual outfit. They were traveling the world. They were trying to discover things, and there were certainly Jesuit scientists of great seriousness and devotion. What the problem happened with Galileo, he made many findings, of course, but the problem with his findings was that he discovered that, or he hypothesized, nobody could quite prove it yet, that the heliocentricity, right, the Earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. And the problem is that the Bible says categorically that the sun moves. The Earth is the center of the world, which was important for the theology of the time, that being the center of the world, this is where Christ had been born. But Galileo was able to hypothesize this could not be the case. And so when the church cottoned onto this, and then they got very upset about it, and eventually, of course, Galileo was subject to trial and such things. But when his book first came out, there were many debates about it. And interestingly enough, if Galileo was working in Venice, the English ambassador to Venice was a very powerful and important person. He was given a copy of Galileo gave him, because he was friends with Galileo. Galileo gave him a copy, which was immediately sent to King James. And King James in England, who was also a rather intellectual figure amongst English kings, read it, and he may have been involved with the decision to send this telescope. The telescope was given to the Shogun in the name of King James. Whether the king really had been the one to decide on it, we can't tell. But certainly by giving a telescope to the Shogun, the English were proposing the latest thing, They could have told things about science that the Jesuits were not teaching Japan. The Jesuits were teaching the Japanese as much about astronomy as they were teaching about God. And the English could turn up and say, look, hey, you don't even know about this latest thing, you're out of date. It would have embarrassed them. The telescope also had value in warfare. Japan is still in the last stages of the Civil War. You can look at troops moving on the battlefield. You don't have to only look at stars with it. So in all kinds of ways, this instrument was very well selected. But unlike Galileo, who just had a wooden tube with a couple of lenses in it, this was a gorgeous thing fit for a royal gift, and no such telescope had ever been produced before. It was absolutely unique. The result is, unfortunately, we don't know exactly what it looked like, but the records give a bit of a description.
We will link to Timon's book in the show notes for today's episode, along with the other resources he's recommended for you today. So make sure you go there to check out those and get a copy to hear the full story. It's well worth your read. Now, Timon, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
If I'm on a desert island, I guess I need to know, first of all, how long I'm going to be stuck there. And if it's going to be a long time,
I would just like to applaud you for asking that question, because in over 200 episodes that we've recorded here at That Shakespeare Life, I've asked that question a lot of times, and most people just assume they're going to be there forever. And I always wondered why we didn't ask, how long am I going to be deserted? So thank you very much for asking that question. But let's say it's going to be a medium length of time, long enough to get bored, but not forever.
Okay, thank you. Well, I wouldn't take my favorite book because I'd devour it in the first 2 days and have nothing left to do for the 3 years until the next ship arrived. So I'd take something that was long and thought-provoking and difficult and didn't get through to you in the first reading. I might take something like Paradise Lost. I might take something like Proust, something that would really keep you going and keep you sane for quite a long while. But who knows? On a desert island, I might just be happy lying in the sun and eating whatever fruit was available and catching fish and leave the whole world of civilization behind. That would also be quite
It doesn't
appealing.
sound like a bad way to handle the desert island, I have to say. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
So while this stuff with East India companies was going on, this shogun who'd gone into retirement and received the telescope died in 1616. Now, your Shakespeare-interested listeners will be intrigued to know, of course, Shakespeare also died in 1616. The shogun and Shakespeare died, I think I'm right in saying, 10 days apart. Because they were using different calendars, it's not always been noticed. At any rate, their deaths were within a couple of weeks of each other. And so at his death, the shogun was deified. Now, Japan is not a monotheistic country. They proverbially say that they have 33,000 gods, although that's probably just a random number. But in any case, another god doesn't matter. But it's pretty unusual in Japan for a human being to be deified. There were precedents for it, but not many. So I'm now writing a book about the deification of this first shogun. His name is Tokugawa Ieyasu, the deification, and what it meant to deify him, why he was deified, and his absolutely gorgeous and spectacular mausoleum is still sitting there, a 2-hour train ride from Tokyo. And any of your listeners that get the chance to go to Tokyo, please go there. It's a place called Nikko. It's directly due north of Tokyo, because north is the direction of kingship. It was built there for very highly symbolic reasons. It's a fantastic and fascinating place. But I got interested in this because most of my work has been about international contacts in the Japanese early modern period. So why I got into this is that I have a hypothesis which is not provable, and whether this will make it into my book or be deleted or something, I don't know. But as the shogun is being deified, the Jesuits are going through a very concerted effort to have Francis Xavier, who was the so-called apostle to the Indies. He brought Christianity to Japan, and then he died. They are trying to have him canonized and made a saint. Now, a Japanese Shinto god and a Roman Catholic Christian saint are actually not that different. They are a Spanish, if the Shinto god had formerly been a human being. They are people who have gone into a different kind of zone, who are by no means absolute gods. They're not all powerful almighty, but they can assist people in the current world. They're people who we should all honor. We might build churches or temples to them. We burn incense to them. We put their images up. And so I say this with slight hesitation in front of your worldwide audience. Maybe I'll delete the hypothesis eventually later on. But I think there must be some link between the very much forcefully proposed canonization processes of the founder of the Japanese mission to Japan by the Jesuits, and at about the same time, the shogun himself being made a Shinto god. Now, having said that, when the shogun went into retirement, when he died in 1616, his son finally can exert power, and the son bans the missions. So Christianity is out. 1616, in fact, already there had been severe persecutions in the last couple of years of the late shogun's life. And by 1616, Japanese Christianity has more or less gone underground, or Christians have gone into self-exile, or they've given up their faith. After all, we have to remember that these missionaries in Japan, few of them spoke Japanese. They were putting across concepts which are pretty hard. I mean, explaining the Trinity, transubstantiation. The average Japanese peasant, it's not stuff that they've ever thought about before. So giving up Christianity, taking Christianity, taking baptism, giving it up later on was not a big deal for very many people. So the Jesuits, it all kind of came to an end. So that's not exactly a very succinct answer to your question, but I am working on this question of the deification of Ieyasu, and I hope a book will be out for your readers to consider reading in a couple of years' time. I have the working title of The Royal Cult of the Shoguns. And that's the working title.
It sounds fascinating. We're certainly looking forward to seeing that come to fruition. Thank you so much, Timon Screech, for being here with us and walking us through the history of William Adams, the first Englishman to go to Japan. Thank you so much for being here and joining us today for this conversation.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, I was taking notes while we were talking, and I didn't write it down. But something I wanted to include in the episode that I would like to ask now, and you let me know if you said it earlier and I just didn't write it down. But okay. I had wanted to ask about where Adams was buried in Japan.
You did ask it and I failed to answer the question, so I can do that now if you want.
Okay, yes, please, if you could, and I'll just splice it back in and tack it on to your answer before.
Okay. Adams's grave has been the subject of interest for well over 100 years, since Japan opened to the West in the mid-19th century. And of course, at that time, Britain was a very powerful country, had much activity in Japan, and word of Adams returned to people's memories and a lot of study of him. Now, there's a monument to him in the lands that the shogun gave him, which are fairly near to modern Tokyo. However, that is not a grave. It's an old monument, and it's been beautifully restored and everything, worth seeing today, but it's not understood to be his grave. He died, the records tell us, down by the port, which is very far away from modern Tokyo. It's right down in the south. I mean, even it's a kind of an hour and a half flight even today on an airplane to get there. But there's a site there which historically people said it's Adams's grave, and there was a marker of a much later period that people had identified. Now, interestingly, Adams was given this name Anjin, but his son had also kept the name Anjin, but took the name Miura Anjin. And Miura was the lands which had been given by the shogun near Tokyo, where this monument is. So the son was called Miura Anjin. A family living next door to this plot that they say is Adams's grave is still called Miura. So they maintain that they are descendants. Now, it'd be pretty hard to prove that, and 400 years have passed, but in any case, it's worth thinking about. That grave had been exhumed in the early 20th century, in 1915 approximately, and they'd found human remains that didn't appear to be Japanese. The bones were too big. But then they'd reburied it, and so that grave was reopened. And one of the major figures involved in that process was Richard Irving, whose book I recommend strongly to your readers on the subject of Adams. they were able to re-exhume the bones. They discovered from DNA, and a little bit of DNA was discovered. They discovered that these bones were of a North European. In other words, they couldn't be Spanish or Portuguese, which otherwise would have been likely for Western bones. There were more Spanish than Portuguese around in Japan. They also seemed very unlikely to be Dutch. And again, I'm not a scientist. I don't know how this conclusion was reached, but it seemed that it's about 95% certain that they are the bones of Adams. Adams had a broken shoulder. He writes about that on a fall from a horse. Sadly, no shoulder bone was found. Had it been, we might have been able to prove one way or the other. But the site of that grave was on the hill looking over the sea. In other words, it was a very prominent spot. Your average sailor who died in Japan, several did, would not have been buried at such a spot. So we can be pretty confident that Adams's bones have been discovered. Now, since he died in May 1620, these discoveries were intended to be announced to the world in May 2020. And there was going to be a big events. And of course, everyone knows COVID hit and it didn't happen. So regrettably, that grave has been beautified, but there haven't been the international attention that had been hoped. That may come later, although we've missed the 400th anniversary. So yes, Adams's grave is known. The DNA has not been sufficient to test the family that lives next door still, or anyone in the area. But I mean, it would be kind of fun if his relations were still alive, but it doesn't matter a whole lot. There is a grave, and if anyone is enthusiastic enough to want to go and visit it, it's on a beautiful little remote island off the coast of southern Japan. It's definitely worth a trip.
Okay. I'll splice that answer back in, and thank you very much for letting me tag that on here at the end. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here.
Pleasure.
This was a whole lot of fun. We haven't covered Adams before on the show, so I was really excited to pull this together. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
thank you so much for being here.
All right. Thank you for inviting me.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Cassidy. Bye.
Be sure to leave us a comment and rating on your favorite podcast platform to let other listeners know where they can learn something new about William Shakespeare. Our show notes for today's episode contain more information on our guest and their research, as well as links to the resources they recommend you use to learn more about today's topic. Find all these things at CassidyCash.com/episode 209. That's CassidyCash.com/EP209. Just like Shakespeare's work, our show is powered by loyal podcast listeners just like you who sign up to be our patrons. We've got a bunch of special bonuses packed into our Patreon area for people who choose to help us keep the lights on in the studio here each week by supporting our show. Patrons get access to things like detailed show notes for our episodes, which includes all of the research that go into the questions and the behind the scenes stuff that we put together here each week. This includes visual content that we just can't share on the audio of our podcast, but it coordinates with the history you're learning about here each week. This includes woodcuts, portraits, sketches, museum exhibit pieces, and more bonus content, as well as in-depth research information. So if you're researching what we're talking about, it's a great resource for you to use as a starting point to explore the topic further. There's other great bonuses packed inside the patrons area, and we would appreciate your support. Check out patreon.com/thatshakespearelife to find out more and sign up today. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.